It's lovely to see so many people. Um, just a little history from my family. My family, of course, lived in Los Angeles and Hollywood, where, as my grandmother called him, Ozzy lived as well until he came to Ireland. So I knew him very well as a child. And I'm very happy to say that tonight's speaker I also knew very well as a young person, because he also came from California. He came from northern or middle California. I came from Los Angeles. And I know if you look at your invitation, you'll see all the details about Arthur Dahl, Dr. Arthur Dahl. I will go through some of those, but I just wanted to say, unusually, usually you tell people all the things about a person, how, what their jobs are, what they've written, where they were educated, all their positions in life. I just wanted to say about Arthur first, that he is one of the most, and perhaps the most, warm-hearted, generous, positive, intelligent people I have ever had the pleasure to know and work with. He is able to connect ideas from a range of disciplines, and he is actually has so many, the way his mind works will unravel during the course of this evening. He speaks very quickly, so you have to listen very closely. You can see all the things that he is. He's an environmental scientist. He's founder and president of the International Environment Forum. He's a retired deputy assistant executive director of UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. He has 50 years of experience at the international level in environment and sustainability. And you can see there, if you've got that in front of you, the number of books and articles that he's written. I'll mention a couple, and Lesson Until, which is a Baha'i focus on the environment, the Eco Principle, Ecology and Economics in Symbiosis, and recently, The Pursuit of Hope, a guide for the seeker. And my company that I work with, George Rattle, has the pleasure of publishing some of those books. Also very recently, and in conjunction with the economist Augusto Lopez Claros and the international lawyer Maya Graf, they have published Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century, which is an amazing, a rich and richly textured book, which I suggest that you look at. I'll try to put the link into the chat. You should also know that Arthur is a member of the Ethical Business Building the Future organization. He teaches at the Wilmette Institute. He is an expert on coral reefs. And if you ever get a chance, I don't know if he's going to show us his pictures tonight, but they are absolutely amazing. He was many years in the Pacific. He has attended numerous United Nations events, including the first so-called environmental conference, which was in Stockholm in 1972. He's just one of the most amazing people. You don't want to hear from me, so I'm now going to hand over to Arthur Dahl.
Thank you for that rather embarrassing introduction. But I sort of welcome to see you all here from around the world, this evening, this morning, this afternoon, whatever it is in your part of the world. And since the theme today is the pandemic that we're all trying to live through, and whether it's an environmental turning point, I think this is a time to be actually saying, where is the world going, and how can we find a way forward, in this time of crisis? The pandemic is probably the greatest global crisis for most of our lifetimes, unless you're very, very old. But then scientists say, well, if you think this is bad, the catastrophe that's coming from climate change and biodiversity collapse will be much worse. So this is not the end of the challenges that we're facing. At the same time, there are positive things in the world. The United Nations adopted in 2015 the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, which really lay out in some detail what we need to do to achieve a sustainable society. But they say we need a fundamental transformation, a paradigm shift for people and planet if we want to go in that direction. And that's part of the theme that I'll try to develop this evening. unfortunately, in spite of the good promises that people sign up to at the United Nations, implementing it is much more difficult. I just saw yesterday, with all the money being spent to try to pull the economy out of the economic crisis that we're facing, $89 billion are being allocated to renewable energies, which sounds considerable, until you consider that $151 billion are going to reinforce fossil fuels. So it's nearly twice as much to go back in the wrong direction rather than going in the right direction. And so, we're struggling between these different processes going ahead, constructive on one hand and not so constructive the other. And of course, with this inertia in the system, it's very difficult to change. In the time of the dinosaurs, they dominated the Earth, and it was only when an asteroid strike exterminated them that the mammals could finally evolve and build a much better system of animals after the dinosaurs were gone. So really say, how do we get rid of the dinosaurs of multinational corporations and an economy based on short-term profit and all the things going wrong with society if we want to move in a more sustainable direction in the years ahead? And of course, the Baha'is have a vision of an emerging world civilization. We have a long-term view of what the society can be like once we get out of this age of transition. And there's a lot of guidance in the Baha'i faith about these processes of disintegration and integration, and that we have guidance to help us navigate our way through the challenges we're facing. And I try to share some of that with you, this evening, because crises are not only a difficult thing to go through, they also can help to change attitudes, remove roadblocks, create opportunities for fundamental change that may not have been there a short time ago. So navigating this crisis is really the challenge we all face individually and collectively. And we'll try to explore this evening, what are those opportunities and how do we leverage them to build a better future? So I'll start now to share my screen because a number of texts I would like to share with you. So if we look at the ecological crisis that we're going through, our population is approaching 8 billion by 2050. It'll be over 9 billion. They anticipate at least 11 billion by 2100. So we have this enormous growth in the world population, but it also is a very unequal kind of growth. 20% of the population consumes 80% of the world's resources, while half the population can hardly make ends meet. I read today that more than 2 billion people don't get enough food to eat, don't have a properly balanced diet. That's an enormous number of people who are silly on the wrong end of development. At the same time, with the climate crisis, we have to change our whole energy system away from fossil fuels. We're seeing increasing water shortages, and they say within a few years, perhaps 2/3 of the world's population will live in countries where water is short. And of course, this will limit what we can do for agriculture and many other things. We're seeing a loss of biodiversity. Scientists are saying we could be losing 1 million species in the years ahead between climate change and land conversion and so on. And of course, all the ecosystem services that nature provides to us are being lost at the same time. There are warnings of food security. The FAO was saying that we could maybe 30, 40 countries will be facing serious famine between climate change and the effects of the pandemic on agricultural food production. And the extremes of wealth and poverty are accelerating. When you look at the number of people falling into poverty during the pandemic, and then you see how much richer the richest fraction of the population has become at the same time, we can see that everything is going in the wrong direction in terms of resolving these social problems. And of course, with all the money governments are spending to try to pull out of the crisis they're in, we're heading towards a financial collapse because so much borrowing is being done with debts that can never be repaid. And of course, if you look simply in terms of the balance at the planet on an ecological sense, one measure is the ecological footprint, which is really calculation, how much land area do you need to provide your food, to absorb your waste, and so on, and so on. And the global average today is 2.3 global hectares per person. In America, it's over 8 global hectares. In China, 3.6, United Kingdom 4.4, Switzerland 4.6, but the resources available are only 1.9 global hectares per person. So we overshot the Earth's capacity in 1900, and each year we're consuming more and more of the capital rather than the interest of the natural systems on which we depend. It's like you're gradually spending the capital in your bank account, and the balance is getting lower and lower and lower. So we're really still heading in the wrong direction in many fundamental ways. Scientists have calculated what are the planetary boundaries? What is the safe operating space for humanity on this planet? They've done 9 of them, and several we've already seriously overshot. Biosphere integrity, genetic diversity, so species is far into the red zone. We're using much too much nitrogen and phosphorus as fertilizers and upsetting the whole chemical balance on the planet. Land system change and climate change are well into the danger area. For a few others, we don't yet know the limits, but clearly, we're really going far beyond what a sustainable planet can support as a human society. So we really have major challenges on our hands trying to find a way out of our present predicament. And of course, the origin of all this is the values we've been living by. The Universal House of Justice, which is the global governing body of the Baha'i faith and that provides guidance to us on a regular basis, wrote that early in the 20th century, a materialistic interpretation of reality had consolidated itself so completely as to become the dominant world faith insofar as the direction of society was concerned. And so really, in a sense, religion has been replaced by materialism for many of at least the richer people around the world. They continued, having penetrated and captured all significant centers of power and information at the global level. Dogmatic materialism ensured that no competing voices would retain the ability to challenge projects of worldwide economic exploitation. The system has been designed to let businesses do business to make their profits, and anything that can prevent them has been pushed aside today. And of course, this materialism rooted in the West has now spread to every corner of the planet, breeding, in the name of a strong global economy and human welfare, a culture of consumerism. It skillfully and ingeniously promotes a habit of consumption that seeks to satisfy the basest and most selfish desires, while encouraging the expenditure of wealth so as to prolong and exacerbate social conflict. One result we can see all around us is a deepening confusion on the part of young people everywhere, a sense of hopelessness in the ranks of those who would drive progress, and the emergence of a myriad social maladies. So we're living in this consumer culture, today's inheritor by default of materialism's gospel of human betterment. And it's unembarrassed by the ephemeral nature of the goals that inspire it. Emboldened by the breakdown of traditional morality, the advance of the new creed is essentially no more than the triumph of animal impulse, as instinctive and blind as appetite. Tendencies once universally castigated as moral failings mutate to necessities of social progress. Selfishness becomes a prized commercial resource. Falsehood reinvents itself as public information, alternative truth, and all the things we hear about today. Under appropriate euphemisms, greed, lust, indolence, pride, even violence acquire not merely broad acceptance, but social and economic value. So we're really living in a very sick society today. And of course, scientists have been warning of this and its consequences for a long time. Most of you are probably not old enough to remember a book published in 1972 called Limits to Growth by some young American researchers who got one of the early computer models and said, let's model the whole global system, the economy, the resources and everything, and say where we're going in this world. And this is the version they published in 1992, where basically they said, if we can do business as usual, and the graphs go from 1900 to the year 2000 to 2100. And they say, well, things would go quite well until about 2020, 2030, when civilization would collapse because we would have overshot the food supply and created so much pollution, life expectancy would drop, and that would be. But this was a message that business didn't want to hear. They did everything to discredit this kind of report, saying this is ridiculous, this is foolish, growth can continue, forever. When they repeated the study, at the time of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, they said, well, in fact, if we made a transition at that time in 1995, we could in fact achieve a more stable society and something sustainable for the future. But they warned us even then, if we waited until 2015 to start making the change, it would be too late to avoid a major decline in civilization in mid-century, and the standard of living we could have after that would be much lower because we would have destroyed so much of the planet's resources. So these were simply scenarios, computer models. So what was the reality? Scientists went back in 2012 to say, how well did the computer predict what has actually happened in the previous 40 years? And they found everything was tracking right on schedule. We were doing slightly better in birth rates and death rates. Apart from that, nothing said that the computer was giving the wrong advice. In fact, the only thing that was no longer possible was a transition to sustainability without some kind of a major crisis during this century. So science is in a sense confirming what the computers have been predicting long ago, that we're heading for difficult times, and it seems like the pandemic may be the parting shot in that process. And of course, the Baha'i writings have provided a lot of guidance about these processes that we're going through. Shoghi Effendi, who was the guardian of the Baha'i faith, the great-grandson of the founder of the Baha'i faith, and the guardian from 1921 to 1957, wrote back in 1936, when he talked about where the world was going, he wrote, the process of disintegration must inexorably continue, and its corrosive influence must penetrate deeper and deeper into the very core of a crumbling age. Much suffering will still be required ere the contending nations, creeds, classes, and races of mankind are fused in the crucible of universal affliction and are forged by the fires of a fierce ordeal into one organic commonwealth, one vast, unified, and harmoniously functioning system. Adversities unimaginably appalling, undreamed of crises and upheavals, war, famine, and pestilence might well combine to engrave in the soul of an unheeding generation those truths and principles which it has disdained to recognize and follow. A paralysis more painful than any it has yet experienced must creep over and further afflict the fabric of a broken society ere it can be rebuilt and regenerated. This was, of course, before World War II, but he also continued these warnings after the Second World War. At the same time, he also talked about the process of integration. Along with this decline, along with the difficulties we were going through, he also saw a process of building taking place. And he said, the principle of the oneness of mankind has its indirect manifestations in the gradual diffusion of the spirit of world solidarity, which is spontaneously arising out of the welter of a disorganized society. And we've seen again today with the pandemic how much solidarity arose and expressed itself spontaneously when people were in need in our communities and in our countries. So the Universal House of Justice, again, the governing body of the Baha'i faith, in January 2019, described these processes of integration and disintegration. They first talked about integration. They wrote, there have been at least 3 historical moments in the last 100 years when it seemed as if the human race was reaching for real, lasting peace. The first moment was the establishment of the League of Nations, an organization intended by its founders to secure peace at the international level. The second was the United Nations organization, formed from the ashes of the League. Towards the end of the 20th century, the third movement, when universal peace seemed to be within grasp, gave rise to explicit calls for the establishment of a new global order. These various advances stand as signs of a widespread, gradual, but inexorable rise in global consciousness on the part of the Earth's peoples, and their attraction to universal justice, to solidarity, to collaboration, to compassion, and to equality. So there are lots of positive things that are being born in this time of transition. At the same time, again, writing in 2019, as the present century opened, new challenges began to loom. Many of the dominant currents in societies everywhere are pushing people apart, not drawing them together. Political and economic systems have enabled the enrichment of small coteries with grossly exorbitant wealth. The interactions of the individual citizen, governing institutions, and society as a whole are often fraught by more and more intransigence in their thinking. And we can see in the polarization of many of our countries today, politically, how far this has gone. Religious fundamentalism is warping the character of communities, even nations. And the failings of so many organizations and institutions of society have understandably led to a decline in public trust. And without trust, it's very hard to build any kind of cooperation or collaboration. This has been exploited systematically by vested interests seeking to undermine the credibility of all sources of knowledge. We've seen with the climate change deniers and skepticism how much science has also been rejected, and even today in some countries the science behind the pandemic is being rejected and avoided with very serious consequences. And then, of course, certain shared ethical principles are eroded, threatening the prevailing consensus about right and wrong. How do you know what is right, what is wrong, when there's so many conflicting? As a result, the will to engage in international collective action has been cowed, assailed by insurgent forces of racism, nationalism, and factionalism. So this recent picture of going backward is really a warning to us that we're not heading in the right direction. And they then continued, thus do the forces of disintegration regroup and gain ground. So be it. The unification of humanity is unstoppable by any human force. And the promises made by the prophets of old and by the author of the cause of God himself, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, testify to this truth. Yet the course humanity takes to achieve its destiny may very well be tortuous. The tumult raised by the contending peoples of the earth threatens to drown out the voices of those noble-minded souls in every society who call for an end to conflict and struggle. As long as that call goes unheeded, there is no reason to doubt that the world's current state of disorder and confusion will worsen, possibly with catastrophic consequences, until a chastened humanity sees fit to take another significant step, perhaps this time decisive, towards enduring peace. So there is hope there that out of this we may be able to finally create the structures we need to bring peace in the world. So are we at an environmental turning point? The environment is part of the challenge we're facing. Clearly, we know environment that often things can sort of go in a certain direction and suddenly you reach a tipping point where things really accelerate and go very quickly in a new or different direction. We've already seen the pandemic, which sort of fits the definition of pestilence, where the deaths upset societies, impact societies around the world. It's really demonstrated we're all part of one single human system. Everybody, everywhere can catch the virus. Rich or poor, whoever they are, nobody is protected from the virus as it spreads around the world. I've already referred to the climate change and biodiversity catastrophes, which are looming in the years immediately ahead. The financial crisis as well, with debts beyond any possible reimbursement. Nobody is clear yet how we're going to find our way out of this challenge, but it doesn't look like a very easy thing to resolve. And the threat of famine, another thing on the horizon. For the moment, one thing missing is war. But given the brilliance of our leaders today, it wouldn't be at all surprising if some of them try that as a way of getting out of their problems or building a power base. And even United Nations, it's 75 years old, is going through a soul searching today. Is it marginalized or can it be renewed in the 75th year? So the whole debate going on about the future of the United Nations. And of course, the pandemic was, of course, many of us have talked about a pandemic for a long time as among the threats on the horizon. It couldn't be predicted, but they're already, even WHO had detailed plans in place for preparation for pandemics, which many governments ignored or even stepped backwards in the last few years, thinking this was too expensive to worry about. But what we've seen is that it has slammed the brakes on the economic system. The inertia of our consumer society and the multinationals, which seemed unstoppable, suddenly, had the brakes put on it. Our consumer society was stopped in its tracks. People couldn't consume. They were locked up at home. And in fact, many people realized that they could live very well without all those necessities that were being sold to them by the various elements of society. They also realized the importance of the social dimension of life. When suddenly you can't see your parents, your children, your grandparents, and so on, or have your usual social relationships, you suddenly realize how important that dimension is. And we saw solidarity appearing everywhere. And in fact, even the invisible workers at the lowest levels of the economy suddenly were acknowledged for their essential services. The garbage collectors, the street sweepers, the people who do the cleaning, the nurses and so on, suddenly have seen to be essential, the cashiers in the markets. So this could be the moment for fundamental transformation. What better opportunity, if you're already slowed down, to make a turn into a new and better direction. So really, we have to question our lifestyle, and the pandemic is helping us to do so. This material lifestyle that seems so essential now appears more superficial and without meaning, as human values, social relations, environment seem much more important. And so many young people particularly say, now is the chance to really think about the environment. So what might an environmental turning point look like? What can we change? What is within our grasp? And what might some of the Baha'i principles help us to find, to go in that direction? The Baha'i international community, in a wonderful statement they wrote in 1995 called The Prosperity of Humankind, wrote that this enterprise of transformation requires a radical rethinking of most of the concepts and assumptions currently governing social and economic life. It must be wedded as well to a conviction that however long the process, whatever setbacks may be encountered, the governance of human affairs can be conducted along lines that serve humanity's real needs. And the book we recently wrote on global governance is an attempt to show some of that direction. And Baha'u'llah warned us more than 100 years ago, the founder of the Baha'i faith, when he told us, take from this world only to the measure of your needs and forgo that which exceedeth them. How often do we think, do I really need this? Or is it something that I feel I must have because it will look good or look wealthy or whatever? And he again wrote, the true seeker should be content with little and freed from all inordinate desire. I've often thought I should write that on the top of my shopping list when I go to the market. And then with respect to the environment itself, Baha'u'llah wrote, every man of discernment, while walking upon the earth, feeleth indeed abashed, inasmuch as he is fully aware that the thing which is the source of his prosperity, his wealth, his might, his exaltation, his advancement and power is, as ordained by God, the very earth which is trodden between the feet of all men. There can be no doubt that whoever is cognizant of this truth is cleansed and sanctified from all pride, arrogance, and vainglory. And of course, Baha'u'llah loved the beauty and verdure of the country. Well, even though he spent many years, in exile and in prison, after 9 years of imprisonment, he remarked to his son one day, "I have not gazed on verdure for 9 years. The country is the world of the soul. The city is the world of bodies." Incidentally, that photograph is a picture of the garden of Linnaeus, the famous 18th century botanist who first named species and really started the science of biodiversity. Baha'u'llah also warned us about our material civilization when he said, "The civilization so often vaunted by the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overleap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. The day is approaching when its flame will devour the cities." And the son of Abdul Baha, who having spent 40 years in prison with his father and the family, was finally released for the Young Turks Revolution in 1908, when he could finally travel to the West to spread his father's teachings, gave a talk on science and religion at Stanford University in California, where I studied, where this picture was taken, in which he said, "The elements and lower organisms are synchronized in the great plan of life. Shall man, infinitely above them in degree, be antagonistic and destroyer of that perfection?" And certainly today we seem to be very rapidly destroying much of the natural perfection that this planet has been endowed with. Again, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, a letter written on his behalf in 1933, talked about the relationship of the spiritual and material sides when he said, "We cannot segregate the human heart from the environment outside us and say that once one of these is reformed, everything will be improved. Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself also deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual interactions." So the spiritual material, both in our personal lives and our society, must come together in this organic relationship that we have. The Baha'i community, again, in a statement they presented in London in 1998, wrote that Baha'i scriptures describe nature as a reflection of the sacred that should serve humanity's efforts to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. However, in light of the interdependence of all parts of nature and the importance of evolution and diversity to the beauty, efficiency, and perfection of the whole, every effort should be made to preserve as much as possible of the Earth's biodiversity and natural order. And they also wrote in this beautiful description about sustainability, "As trustees or stewards of the planet's vast resources and biological diversity, humanity must learn to make use of the Earth's natural resources, both renewable and non-renewable, in a manner that ensures sustainability and equity into the distant reaches of time." The Baha'i concept of time is quite different. For a business, it's a quarterly report. For a politician, a 5-year plan, perhaps. Baha'is talk about a dispensation of 1,000 years and a cycle of 500,000 years of civilization. We're looking at a very different way of defining sustainability. This attitude of stewardship will require full consideration of the potential environmental consequences of all development activities. It will compel humanity to temper its actions with moderation and humility, which are not words we hear very often in the mouths of economists or politicians, unfortunately. Realizing that the true value of nature cannot be expressed in economic terms. It will also require a deep understanding of the natural world and its role in humanity's collective development, both material and spiritual. Therefore, sustainable environmental management must come to be seen not as a discretionary commitment mankind can weigh against other competing interests, but rather as a fundamental responsibility that must be shouldered, a prerequisite for spiritual development as well as the individual's physical survival. Again, this balance of material and spiritual that is so important. And with respect to climate change, the Universal House of Justice talks about this as one of the most pressing problems of humanity in the current century. Is how a growing, rapidly developing, and not yet united global population can, in a just manner, live in harmony with the planet and its finite resources. Certain biological realities present themselves when an organism negatively affects or exceeds the capacity of its ecosystem. Limited availability and inequitable distribution of resources profoundly impact social relations within and between nations in many ways, even to the point of precipitating upheaval and war. And particular arrangements of human affairs can have devastating consequences for the environment. The question of the impact of climate change and to what extent it is man-made and its effects can be ameliorated is today a major aspect of this larger problem. The revelation of Baha'u'llah directly and indirectly touches on a range of such concerns in a manner that speaks to a harmony between society and the natural world. It is essential, therefore, that Baha'is contribute to thought and action regarding such matters. And the Baha'i community, in another statement on climate change, refining the challenge of climate change, wrote in 2008 that this is the opportunity to take the next step in the transition from a state-centered mode of interacting on a world stage to one rooted in the unity which connects us as the inhabitants of one biosphere, the citizens of one world, and the members of one human civilization. In the face of the destructive impacts of climate change, exacerbated by the extremes of wealth and poverty, a need for new approaches centered on the principles of justice and equity is apparent. The challenge is a moral one, which calls for the transformation of thoughts and behaviors so as to allow our economic and social structures to extend the benefits of development to all people. And we need to review the climate change challenge through a new lens, one that perceives humanity as a unified whole, not unlike the cells of the human body, infinitely differentiated in form and function, yet united in a common purpose which exceeds that of its component parts. A beautiful biological analogy. The U.S. House of Justice, in March of this year, so after the beginning of the pandemic, wrote, "Seldom has it been more evident that society's collective strength is dependent on the unity it can manifest in action, from the international stage to the grassroots." And they quoted from Abdul Baha, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, again, about an earlier situation very similar. In a day such as this, when the tempests of trials and tribulations have encompassed the world, and fear and trembling have agitated the planet, ye must rise above the horizon of firmness and steadfastness, with illumined faces and radiant brows, in such wise that, God willing, the gloom of fear and consternation may be entirely obliterated, and the light of assurance may dawn over the manifest horizon and shine resplendently. The House of Justice then continued, the world stands more and more in need of the hope and strength, the spirit of faith that imparts. And they encouraged us to be involved in elevated conversations as a source of comfort and inspiration to many. Such efforts on your part provide a valuable service at this hour when many souls are perplexed and dismayed, unsure of what will be. However difficult matters are at present, and however close to the limits of their endurance some sections of societies are brought, humanity will ultimately pass through this ordeal, and it will emerge on the other side with greater insight and with a deeper appreciation of its inherent oneness and interdependence. So this is a lesson we need to learn, and we see this positively. It may be difficult to go through what we're going through, and it could easily get worse rather than better, but with that vision of where it will lead us and the lessons we're learning, that can help us to be positive and encourage others to see these problems in a positive light and to find their way through them. And in fact, then on the 20th of April, again, the House has said the expectation that they expressed in that earlier message that this test of humanity's endurance would grant it greater insights is already being realized. Leaders, prominent thinkers, and commentators have begun to explore fundamental concepts and bold aspirations that, in recent times, have been largely absent from public discourse. At present, these are but early glimmerings, yet they hold out the possibility that a moment of collective consciousness may be in view. I think this is a way that can encourage us to move forward. And they wrote this last year, world unity is finally possible. A global order that unifies the nations with the assent of humanity is the only adequate answer to the destabilizing forces that threaten the world. However, though world unity is possible, nay, inevitable, it ultimately cannot be achieved without unreserved acceptance of the oneness of humankind, which is really our task today, to build that sense of oneness, both environmentally, socially, racially, and everything else. So, to bring all this down to a more practical level, how can we as individuals be more sustainable, in our communities be more sustainable? How do we resist the superficial attractions of the materialistic consumer society? Can we transform our values, giving priority to principles of justice, equity, generosity, moderation, service, and unity and diversity? We can draw motivation from the moral, ethical, and spiritual principles common to the great religious traditions, and most recently elaborated in the Baha'i faith. We need to understand how the lack of spirituality is behind the rising frustration, fear, hate, rejection, and division threatening social catastrophes. And we can counter the forces of disintegration that we've described previously with stronger forces of integration, of solidarity and unity, starting with ourselves, our families, and in our own communities. So, at a very practical level, as individuals, what can we do to live more sustainably? Re-examine our values, educate ourselves to the issues, which is why you're here tonight, perhaps. Changing our way of thinking to be more integrated, more systemic, and long-term. Looking over with more solidarity to others, and living lightly on the earth, being content with little, as Baha'u'llah called for. In terms of the other, we talk about things like water. Water is a critical resource. How much do you need for washing, bathing, doing your laundry and gardening? And how can you reduce pollution of the water? For energy, a critical resource which you have to transform. How do we economize how much energy we use? Use it more efficiently in our heating, our cooling, cooking, lighting, and appliances. There are lots of new possibilities coming forward. We rely very much on transport. Can we reduce it and replace motor vehicles with fossil fuels by public transport, bicycles, or walking in many cases? When it comes to eating, we have many choices of lifestyle. fast food or organic, meat or vegetarian, local or fair trade, looking at nutritional balance, the risk of contamination with pesticides or hormones or antibiotics or genetically modified organisms. These are not easy choices. Sometimes local produce grown in a heated greenhouse may consume much more energy than something imported, say, from Morocco or someplace like that, in terms of the total energy consumption. It's not always easy to find what is the best choice in each situation. But we need at least ask the questions and explore as far as we can what choices we have. Do we think about clothing and its environmental impacts? Natural fibers, but maybe they were grown in Turkey with high pesticide use poisoning the agricultural workers. Synthetic fibers are persistent, non-renewable, but produce microplastic particles. I was once cleaning up an old dump. I found a pair of shorts buried for 30 years. I'm still wearing them for painting. So nothing happened to them in 30 years of burial, which just shows how long these artificial things can last in the environment if we're not careful. In our role as consumers, we can consider issues of socially responsible manufacture. Do we need to follow changing styles? Or maybe use things until they wear out? How desirable is it to make choices based on brand names and for fashions, or really playthings to the ignorant today? For housing, when you can choose, you look at the location, the materials it's built with, the health impacts, intrinsically social effects. Lots of things can be adapted when we consider where we're living. For recreation, tourism and entertainment, what are their impacts on the natural environment? What, do we use too much transport? Are there alternatives like ecotourism or doing something near to home? We also look at the aesthetic aspect of the environment. We need beauty. We need contact with nature as opposed to totally man-made systems. We need to respect cultural diversity and many other dimensions that all come into that concept of sustainability today. So, to summarize, the pathway to sustainability will be one of empowerment, collaboration, continual processes of questioning, learning, and action in all regions of the world. It will be shaped by the experiences of women, men, children, the rich, the poor, the governors, and the governed, as each one is enabled to play their rightful role in the construction of a new society. As the sweeping tides of consumerism, unfettered consumption, extreme poverty, and marginalization recede, they will reveal the human capacities for justice, reciprocity, and happiness. So I'll stop sharing slides now and just a few final comments. So what does the pandemic mean for the environment? Where are we going with the pandemic and the environment now at the moment? We might say you could think of three competing scenarios for what might happen. One, returning to business as usual. There are lots of companies that want to go back to making money they were making before. The rich want to get richer and so on. There are enormous forces trying to go back to the way life was before the pandemic came. On the other hand, we also see in many places this xenophobic populist retreat into a fortress world, rejecting multilateralism, wanting to go back to some kind of complete independence and national sovereignty and so on. In many ways, taking things backward. And this is being driven by all those who weren't benefiting from the economic success previously. All the people whose salaries hadn't increased, the people losing their jobs and so on, didn't see any alternative, grasping at anything that might give them some hope in the future. Or we can imagine a transition to sustainability, really working with the principles I've described in this presentation and making the changes we need and creating a new kind of civilization that is in harmony with the natural environment. And of course, since we don't have any kind of global governance to decide where we're going, we're probably drifting in all three directions at the same time. Some countries rapidly going back to business as usual, others closing in on themselves and trying to protect themselves against the rest of the world, and some really trying to lead in a transition towards a better future. So we really see disintegration and integration taking place at the same time. Unfortunately, it's easier to break something than to fix it. And for the moment, there's more disintegration than integration. And how do we shift that balance to go in the right direction? We've seen countries that have failed to contain the pandemic through poor governance. And this is a threat to the whole world, because when the virus is still spreading, it will always bounce back again and creep in wherever we are. So what do we do about poor governance? Do we have to improve governance at the global level? We also see countries too poor to control the pandemic. They may have been affected more slowly, but now it's spreading rapidly, in South Africa, in India, in Latin America, Africa may be next, and so on. And because they don't have the health systems to respond, many more will suffer and die as a result. So this is devastating. We can't afford to let poverty persist anywhere in the world. Poverty, again, makes us vulnerable wherever we are. We need a universal system of healthcare and social protection to avoid this kind of thing from happening again. And of course, even if a vaccine is discovered rapidly, it will take years to bring the virus under control everywhere, because in most places, health systems to apply it do not yet exist. The risk of rebound will prevent a return to the free movement of the wealthy around the world, tourism, and so on, in the immediate future. Look at a country like New Zealand, the great success. They stamped out the virus. They're trapped behind their borders. They can't go anywhere or let anybody in. Even an individual success, in a larger sense, doesn't work either. So as long as we're not ready to go to the next level of organization, we're going to be finding, these problems. We need effective global government to organize society at the global scale, the scale of the problems we're facing today. We don't know what's going to come after the pandemic, whatever catastrophe may be. There will certainly be more and more pressures for environmental change. And as long as nations and peoples resist that change, things will only get worse. The best thing we can do, just in conclusion, to start on a positive note, in the short term, is that we can build united local communities for resilience and solidarity in the face of difficulties. That's the best insurance possible, as the Baha'is are trying to do around the world with their community activities. We also need to participate in public discourses on these issues, talk about the solutions, talk about the principles that will allow us to change. Because there is a positive future, and there are things we can do move in that direction, both in terms of our values and our practical actions, to build some momentum in that direction. So I hope that this way we can combine realism about the present challenges and hope for the future. And so now I'd like to be open to questions and discussion, and hope that I have not left you too depressed and inspired to go out and make some changes in your own life and start helping others to make changes in theirs as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Can we just all wave our hands and thank him? You can see us applauding his wonderful talk, bringing together so many threads from the Baha'i teachings into one marvelous talk.